last chapter. Video 40. Be blessed. Be prosperous. Be completed. Okay. Hey, where's my little reading aid? Oh no. Oh my gosh, where did it go? Ah, this is it. Alright. Chapter 10. Resisting Influence. Is it possible to resist strong influence of an overt or subtle kind? Sargent maintains that any normal person will eventually crack under interrogation, if the pressure is kept up long enough. Yet there are known occasions of successful resistance against brainwashing techniques. In That Bad Place, for instance, while a third of American P.O.W.s capitulated in some way to their captors, the Turks, who suffered the same treatments in the same camps, did not collaborate in even the most minor ways. Nor did any of their men die in captivity, whereas hundreds of Americans did. Whereas the American morale was low, the Turks deliberately kept morale high. If one of their number became ill, the others were assigned to feed and bathe him to ensure that he had a chance to recover. Internal discipline was maintained at all costs. Whereas the Americans suffered psychologically from the bad people's tactic of removing leaders from the rest of the group, the Turks implemented a solution which prevented the bad guys from breaking down their morale. If the Turkish officer in command was removed, his role was assumed by the next man down. If that man was removed, the command shifted downward again, and so it would go on until, if necessary, the private was in command. The Turkish response to the bad guys' interrogation techniques was derision. Their mass resistance won the day. Derision means to mock, make fun of, develop that attitude that I told you about that only a lunatic could have. Watch the movie Heart's War. Brown, in his analysis of events in Bad Place, in Techniques of Persuasion, came to the conclusion that the lack of morale among the prisoners who collaborated was the main factor in leaving them vulnerable to bad guys' coercion techniques. He pointed out that in any form of persuasion, from the mildest to the most severe, it is always the case that those who refuse to cooperate are in no danger, while those who give the slightest indication of doing so are doomed. The validity of that comment may well be attested to by any who have experienced mild interest in the wares of the door-to-door salesman, either out of politeness or mild curiosity. Jessica Mitford, in Hans and Rebels, describes the brainwashing effects of the salesman's techniques if he is just allowed that opening in order to pitch in. She says, in essence, it consisted of a deft combination of mental torture and physical manipulation designed to reduce the subject to a state of helpless passivity, bereft of independent will, and ready to sign anything as a condition of freedom from torment. Many investigators of the bad experience have noted tactics which seem to help resistors resist. Okay, let's take a drink. We're so eager to get this finished. But we're not going anywhere until it's done. It is of interest that most are common sense notions that emphasize the need to develop and maintain correct perspective on life, ordinary life. So, many investigators of that bad experience have noted tactics which seem to help resistors resist. It is of interest that most are common sense notions that emphasize the need to develop a correct perspective on ordinary life. Much mentioned as a means of getting information and situations into correct perspective is humor. Rouleau points out that the demagogue is almost incapable of humor of any kind. Fervor effectively leaves no room for laughter. But if the demagogue is treated with humor, he is out of his element and starts to collapse. The ability to laugh means the ability to see how things should be. Jokes work by highlighting ridiculous behavior or by providing an unexpected perspective on a given situation. Lady Astor to William Churchill at a dinner party said, "Mr. Churchill, if I were married to you, I should put you in prison. I should put poison in your coffee." Mr. Churchill said, "Madam, if I were married to you, I should drink the coffee." The graffiti that appears on public walls of sufficient wit to find its way into published collections of the stuff is all about the alternative ways of arranging available information. The momentary suspension of belief that operates when a joke is being heard allows the hearer to open his mind to a new way of seeing perhaps a familiar scenario, or a new way of interpreting familiar behavior patterns. A joke is funny because it confounds one's normal expectations of how things turn out, and when we hear a joke, we invite our expectations to be confounded. Serious information is less easily assimilated if it goes against our established beliefs. Because the ability to laugh signifies the ability to suspend belief and to see and hear what is instead of what we expect to see or hear, it enables us to recognize a distortion when it confronts us, according to Merleau. How can the demagogue be taken seriously? But to be effective, the demagogue must be taken seriously. Sargent makes the point that the best way to avoid conversion of any kind is to not get emotionally involved in the proceedings. Once guilt, fear, and anger are stored up, one is halfway to being one. Therefore, he concludes, "The obstacles that the religious or political proselytizer cannot overcome are indifference, or detached, controlled, and continuous amusement on the part of the subject at the efforts being made to break him down, or to win him over, or tempt him into agreement or argument. The safety of the free world seems therefore to lie in the cultivation not only of courage, moral virtue, and logic, but of humor. Humor, which produces the well-balanced state in which emotional excess is laughed at as ugly and wasteful." You hear that, kitty? Humor. Humor. The Turks made use of humor when they derided the propaganda of the bad guys. Investigation of the crew of the U.S. spy ship Pueblo, which was captured off the Bad Place coast in 1968, showed that those who stood out most easily against confessing to criminal acts were those who used humor, among other things, as a defense mechanism. Humor is therefore not only a tool for keeping one's own perspective balanced, but an aid, via its absence, to identifying those others who have no sense of perspective. Beware of the leaders of causes, salesmen, and experts who cannot genuinely laugh at themselves. The need to detach oneself emotionally from a pressured situation was also identified in an experiment by Zimbardo. As part of his work for the U.S. Office of Naval Research, Zimbardo carried out his own now famous prison experiment. He advertised in the papers for healthy male volunteers, and of 75 applicants, the 24 most emotionally stable were selected. None had prison records. On an arbitrary basis, half were assigned to be prison guards, the rest to be prisoners. The prison was a mock-up built in the Stanford University. The guards were told they had to keep order, but that they couldn't resort to physical punishment of any kind. Zimbardo actually arranged for the prisoners to be arrested on the day for the experiments to begin. Police cars collected them from their homes. They were handcuffed, then photographed and fingerprinted at the police station before being taken to the prison. where their clothes were replaced by prison garb, a smock, no underwear, prison number on the back of the smock, and a nylon cap which covered their hair, and therefore made the men look pretty much the same. And the guards wore khaki uniforms. The prisoners had started a normal type of prison routine: work, limited visiting rights, bland food at meal times, and by the second day, signs of extreme stress were already evident, including depression and crying and very acute anxiety. The guards, meanwhile, were enjoying their new power, were upset when the experiment was called to a halt earlier than intended, because of the effects it was having on the prisoners. Later, the guards professed themselves amazed at the degree to which they had indulged in their power, harassing and provoking the prisoners. That the experiments that the experience had been real to the prisoners was shown by incidents such as the following. Several came before a parole board asking to be allowed to be released, for which they could give up their pay for taking part in the experiment. The parole officer, Zimbardo, said he would think about it, and the prisoners went quietly back to their cells, although any of them could have just insisted on being released there and then. While the experiment was going on, Zimbardo monitored the private conversation of the prisoners. He found that 90% of it was concerned with the prison conditions and how bad everything was there. They allowed the misery induced by being in the prison to dominate their lives and conversations, thus increasing the intensity of its effects. They did not escape from it mentally by talking with each other about their real lives outside, or by any other topics of general interest. That's weird. The experiment was commonly cited to show the power of the prison environment to influence the behavior of those in power and those under it. But Peter Watson, in War on the Mind, suggests that the real purpose of the experiment was to find out how prisoners of war can be taught to withstand the pressures of their captivity. Firstly, it was the U.S. Navy that financed the study. Secondly, the simulated prisoners were men with clean records. They had not taken a risk by committing a crime and failed, thus incurring punishment. They were men who could feel their incarceration was unjust, which was more the case for captured servicemen than convicted prisoners. Thirdly, their heads were all covered by nylon caps, a symbolic shaving of the head, which occurred in prison camps, but not in prisons. And the guards wore khaki, military rather than civilian style. What the experiment therefore revealed was in prisoner of war camps, the very worst thing was for prisoners to wallow in their condition and allow it to overcome them. They would avoid harping on the vicissitudes of their environment and make efforts to escape mentally by turning their attention to other things. If they did bow to their sufferings, they ended up not only denigrating themselves, but denigrating each other, as the experimental prisoners did, which further served to weaken group ties. In Among the Dervishes, O.M. Burke describes a conversation with a Turkish Sufi who claimed that the only way he and his co-fighters survived in that bad place was by the practice of getting together every day and telling stories about the perfectibility of mankind, the destiny of the human race, and the qualities such as generosity and love. Getting outside a situation is one of the best ways of seeing it for what it is, instead of becoming swamped by it and helpless to resist. People who suffer from depression are commonly advised not to keep thinking about the bad times, or don't read distressing news reports, or don't keep going back to places that remind you of a memory of someone lost, because each serves to reinforce the feelings of depression. Snapping out of it, however, becomes impossible if the depression is allowed to take hold. Immersion in any experience mars one's judgment about its import and its true relationship to other events in life. Jacobo Timmerman, who underwent imprisonment and torture in Argentina, described how he detached himself emotionally from his predicament in order to save himself from succumbing to it. He said, "I realized that, instinctively, I had developed an attitude of absolute passivity. This passivity, I believe, preserved a great deal of energy, as I was becoming a vegetable, casting aside all logical emotions and sensations, fear, hatred, vengeance, or any emotion or sensation, meant wasting useless energy. Both parties seemed to feel some need of each other. For the torturer, it is a sense of omniscience, without which he would find it hard, perhaps, to exercise his profession. The torturer needs to be needed by the tortured, whereas the man who's tortured finds in his torturer a human voice, a dialogue for his situation, some partial exercise of his human condition. He asks for pity, to go to the bathroom, for another plate of soup. He asks for the result of a football game. I was able to avoid all that." Observer, July 19th, 1981. By emotional detachment of whatever means, political prisoners have thus been able to preserve their integrity. Their situation, by the very fact it is extreme, serves to highlight the fact that emotional involvement in any circumstance, I hope the word circumstance, yay, can affect one's judgment of it. Oh, ouch. The kindly con man regularly takes advantage of that. Emotions color perceptions. Once that is recognized, one can say, "Well, just because I like him, or he excites me, or he sympathizes with me, doesn't mean he knows how to invest my money." The opposite of emotional detachment is emotional self-centeredness, to which insecure people all too often fall prey. Thus, if in conversation the insecure person says or hears someone say, "I find it difficult to relate to people who are self-opinionated," he will start to worry. "I wonder if he thinks I'm self-opinionated," and start to act defensively. The speaker may not have considered the matter at all, and may even be irrelevant to the particular conversation, but the listener, by relating all he hears back to himself, opts to place himself in a vulnerable position. He is always too anxious about what people might think about him to hear anything that they have to say about anything else. Several commenters on The Bad Place have pointed out that soldiers who were uncertain of their facts, or who accepted ideas blindly, were the more susceptible to influence. One is more susceptible to persuasive reasoning if one has never cultivated the capacity to think for oneself, to ask questions, to check facts, or, in other words, to take responsibility for the information one accepts. The result is often an inability to distinguish between fact and opinion. The main thrust of health education today is to encourage people to take more responsibility for their health. Oh, that was before the COVID brainwashing. Instead of leaving it to their doctors. The Good Health Guide, a general readership publication produced by the Open University in association with the Health Education Council and the Scottish Health Education Unit, emphasizes the individual's responsibility to question assumptions about health, saying, "We are all selective about the information we retain and what we believe. One of the key factors affecting this is our own position in life. If, for example, you smoke 50 cigarettes a day and can't give them up, you will resist accepting the fact that cigarettes cause that thing. Someone who has never smoked and finds cigarettes unpleasant will find this fact very easy to believe." Blah, 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 blah. Similarly, if you are well off,
You may find it hard to accept the fact that poor people have much more illness than people who are comfortably off. It may make you feel guilty. However, if you are poor, you'll know it's true. Illness is part of your life. The relationship between money and ill health is a fact. What is still open to opinion is why people literally. Some opinions are eventually shown to be facts, others aren't. You'll need to think very carefully about your facts and try to check whether they are really opinions. Try asking yourself these two questions. Where did I get the information from? What personal interest do I have in believing or not believing certain information?
An unwitting emotional investment in believing certain factors may impair one's intellectual detachment. Unquestioning acceptance of partial truths may also lead to erroneous beliefs. We are led to believe by advertisers that certain sweets and chocolates give us energy. Well, that is quite true, but they omit saying that all foods provide energy. If by that omission the public comes to believe that if you want to up your energy levels, you should eat sweets and chocolates, the advertisers have achieved their aim, and the public has been duped. Okay. Investigating why one holds a belief protects one from being influenced as a result of ignorance. The belief in a fact ceases to be belief. It is replaced by knowledge. Belief testing is one means for taking responsibility for oneself instead of passing it to others, a tendency that was highlighted in a previous chapter. Just as relinquishing responsibility is mentioned as one reason for becoming susceptible to influence, so exercising subjective control in, however limited circumstance, can have the converse effect, according to Biederman. He has described the tactic of a man who was tortured during interrogation by the Gestapo, and knew that the point would come when he could not prevent himself from passing out. However, he found that he could control the point at which he fainted by deciding, I will not pass out for another 60 seconds. This minor evidence that he could still in some way control what happened to him enabled him to maintain his mastery of the situation, and he didn't crack during several months of intense interrogation. He remained, in his own mind, acting rather than acted upon. Even Timberman's passivity during his torture in Argentina was a consciously adopted stance, chosen as a means of retaining as much control over himself, his actions, and his responses as he could under the circumstances. An everyday example of a minor exercise of control affecting one's perception of self and situation is the feminist tactic recommended by American therapist and feminist Betty Dodson. The feminist tactic for not being treated as a sex object. Many women dislike receiving admiring catcalls, suggestive offers, or explicit comments about their anatomy from men they pass in the street. They feel embarrassed and helpless to express the hostility they feel. Every such experience just reinforces their feeling that they are simply seen as sex objects and that they have no control over the situation. The feminist response is to act on the situation to change its nature. When men make approaches on the street, says Betty, I give them the kind of eye contact I'd give an old friend. I'd smile, I'd say hi, lovely day, treat them as a mate I've known for years, and make really polite conversation. The fact that he's actually contacting with me rather than at me alters his whole attitude. He begins to see me as a person rather than a sex object, and he stops bothering me. From Psychology Today, UK, January 1979, page 25. By such a trivial ploy, a woman can effectively reinforce for herself the conviction that she can influence, instead of just being influenced by such encounters. Learned helplessness, as was shown in Chapter 4, is purely a product of faulty conditioning, and once one is aware of it, can be reversed. The fixed idea is the enemy of all free thinking. It is far more difficult to accept that two opposing ideas may not be mutually exclusive than, in a desire for absolutes, to plumb for one or the other. That two opposing actions may not be mutually exclusive either. It was neatly demonstrated by American psychologist Ulrich Neisser and colleagues. They demonstrated that it is possible for people to learn to read and write simultaneously without losing concentration. Their subjects were required to read short stories and at the same time take down dictation about something else. At first they found the task impossible, but after 6 weeks their reading speeds were normal and their dictation correct. Ooh, I want to try that. I want to write a book while reading a book. Oh my God. Okay. Oh, my body hurts. Oh, I need a nap. Okay. To check that the subjects had not resorted to automatic pilot for one of the activities while concentrating on the other, the researchers tested them for understanding of both what they had read and what they had written. The subjects had absorbed all the material. They could literally be more open-minded than they had imagined possible. All the studies of the American prisoners of war in that bad place showed that those who had stable, integrated personalities were the least likely to succumb to the bad people propaganda. The important thing was to have a balanced perspective on life. Hello, baby, hello, baby. Most therapies emphasize that the key to mental health is to accept life for what it is, and face it for what it is, instead of working on the basis of what we want it to be. To accept life for what it is, we first have to know how it is, and that must include an understanding of how conditioning and emotions and needs and assumptions can affect our behavior and our perceptions. Only if we know that sometimes we act a certain way because we are looking for social approval, and another time we react a certain way because we want attention or security, can we make realistic judgments about causes and effects. Philip Zimbardo is currently working on a research project to test the hypothesis that a tendency to overlook realistic causes for inexplicable occurrences may actually be the cause of certain mental illnesses. Hypothesis that a tendency to overlook realistic causes for inexplicable occurrences could be the cause of illness. Overlook realistic causes. Okay. He hypnotized a group of students to suffer an impairment to their hearing when he said a certain word. The word was spoken later during a discussion session with other students. Afterward, he found out that the students who had been hypnotized were convinced that other people were talking about them and wanting to harm them. Because it was assumed that everyone else must be whispering, Zimbardo suggests that many paranoid elderly people may become so because they don't realize they are losing their hearing. Intéressant. They accuse family and friends of whispering about them, and the family and friends, so amazed by the bizarre behavior, they do start to worry and talk about them behind their backs. Similarly, he says, a person may develop a phobia of lifts because one day he was feeling queasy and he happens to get into a lift. He then decides that the lift must be making him sick. Many emotional problems, according to Zimbardo, could be caused by inappropriate blame, which I agreed to very much in 2009. We can't be impervious to external influences. Even the weather, as it is now known, can affect us physiologically and emotionally, though, in our ignorance, we may assume that our debility or depression is due to some other cause. Perhaps it is only by standing back, emotionally, and testing our assumptions that we can become more the masters of ourselves and correspondingly less the slaves of circumstance. The end. Oh, the end. We finished it. It was a very, very good book. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me in my shenanigans.